Attention humans, Bigfoot, Jersey Devil, extraterrestrials, chupacabras, dogmen, werewolves, ghostly entities, humanoids, yowies, and any other worldly beings. This video may contain profanity that is not suitable for your offspring or children. Viewer discretion is advised. Thank you for your attention, and let's get back to the feast. Good evening, listeners. Welcome back to the best place on YouTube to turn your nightmares into reality. Recordings of this legendary monster date back to before 1811, where stories of how this animal began terrorizing townspeople in Alberta, Canada originated. History supports the possibility of this monster, and the number of annual sightings in the United States only continues to rise since the 1950s. Whether you're a believer or not, don't allow yourself to become this creature's next easy meal. With encounters becoming more frequent and closer to our own backyard, you never know what may be creeping directly outside your bedroom window. Enjoy these 6 true Bigfoot encounters. Additionally, I wanted to thank you all for the immense show of support on my first video. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this video as well. If you have an encounter or scary story you'd like to share, please submit your encounter to ThroughTheNightYT@yahoo.com. With that being said, latch your windows, lock your doors, and let's get into these horrifying encounters. It's in the Cornfield by Denton1919. My encounter took place near Kane, Pennsylvania in 2014. Now, I'm a skeptic. I tend to not believe in anything that I can't witness with my own eyes, or things I'm unable to prove without factual evidence. And this is why this encounter changed the way I think entirely. I remember this incident like it was yesterday. I remember being 15 at the time, and as any 15-year-old, I used to sneak out from time to time. Unlike most 15-year-olds, I didn't do anything when I snuck out. I would just take night walks around my hometown. This might sound crazy to some of you, but I lived in rural Pennsylvania, in a town where nothing ever happened, and even at 15 years old, I wasn't afraid of anything in that area. That's until my encounter. So, it's important that I set the scene early on. When I would sneak out, I would always jump out of my bedroom window, which led directly into our carport, which is an overhang under which you can park your vehicle, and they typically have no walls. To jump out of my window, I had to stand on my bed, which was cornered in my bedroom, with one window at the headboard and the window I would jump out of to my left if you were laying on your back in the bed. Our house was cornered on 3 sides by Cornfield, and the front of my house faced the street, which is where I would begin my walks. Keep in mind, all around the rest of the house was Cornfield, which was up at this time of year. One summer night in July, I had decided to go for a walk. The walk started out normal, like any other night, but almost immediately as I turned onto the street, the atmosphere completely changed. That's the only way I can really describe it. I noticed that even though it was roughly 1:30 a.m., it was dead quiet. Not the normal nighttime quiet, but the kind of quiet that makes you feel as if you can hear your own heart beating in your ears. The kind of quiet that makes you wish the gulp sound your throat makes when you swallow wasn't so loud. You know that feeling when someone's watching you? Or when you're in your room in the pitch black as a child and you can't see anything, so you imagine the worst thing in the world is in the room with you? That's how this was. For no apparent reason, I avoided the shadows casted by the streetlights and often caught myself watching in between the houses as I walked. And despite walking as fast as possible, I felt as if something was with me, if that makes sense. After a grueling and nerve-wracking walk, I decided to head back to my house. As I climbed into my window, I glanced around the carport one last time, right where my window was located. Oddly enough, I began noticing things that seemed out of order, like the freshly turned dirt at the entrance to the backside of the carport that led to the cornfield, and the eerily quiet setting that I found myself in. Trying to convince myself that this is how it was when I left, I quickly jumped into my window and slid it closed, latching the lever lock mechanism as tightly as possible. Now, this is where my mind changed from being a skeptic to becoming a believer. Within an hour, I was in bed, just as a storm was coming through my quiet town. Not the sort of storm that soaks everything in a downpour, but the kind that brings lightning, some thunder, and some really heavy winds. As I'm laying in my bed, dozing off with my chihuahua, Hazel, between my legs, I notice the wind is picking up outside. However, I ignored this and quickly fell asleep. Sometime later, I honestly can't tell you if it was 15 minutes or 2 hours, I wake up to Hazel slowly walking up onto my stomach, and then my lower chest, growling the entire way up. Her eyes are fixated at the window at my head. She begins barking, and once again, not the kind of barking that chihuahuas do when someone knocks on your door, but the kind when they're actually terrified. Her hair is standing up down her back, and she has a frightened mohawk running down her spine. I immediately, without moving anything but my arms, grab her and hush her quiet. She stops moving but maintains her stare at the window, only stopping because I'm just about squeezing the breath out of her. I don't move at this point. I lay there for what feels like 10 minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. All at once, I make the decision. I convince myself to jump up and run across the room, in the pitch black. As I reach the far side of the room, I look at the window above from where I was just laying, and nothing. There's nothing there at all. At this point, I slowly make my way toward the window and peer out, ever cautiously. Now, I'm at the far side of the house, down to the very right if you're fronting the house, the very end. So all I can see is the carport to my right, the cornfield in front of me, and even though the rest of the house is to the left of the window, I don't see anything down the left side of the house. As I stare out the window, I begin hearing this loud thumping. I mean, this is loud, and it sounds as if someone or something is pounding the side of the house down to the left. I slowly and reluctantly place my face to the window and try and see down the length of the house, but I'm unable to see anything. Now the pounding is getting louder and louder. At this point, it's terrifying me. With each pound, I actually feel my body rocking, like there's an internal earthquake inside me. 2 thumps, 3 more thumps, 4 more thumps. After about 25 seconds, I step back as it's getting closer, afraid of what happens next. Finally, I come to the realization that my chest is hurting. I begin to breathe. I realize that the pounding was my own heart. I had been holding my breath in anticipation and fear since I grabbed Hazel a few minutes ago, and my heart was beating so hard in fear that it was rocking my body. Trying to calm myself down, I took a few deep breaths, and I gained composure and slowly looked out my window again. This time, I saw it. Even though the sound of my heartbeat is what was scaring me before, it's impossible to mistake what I just saw when I looked out the window this time. Just inside the cornfield, which is about 15 yards in front of me, maybe 2 rows in, I saw a dark silhouette of something large. Its head rose about a foot over the 6-foot corn stalks, and I could clearly see the mass of this thing, even a few rows deep into the cornfield. It wasn't moving. It just stood there, facing in my direction. Backing away in terror from the window, I saw it crouch, almost as if it realized that I saw it. That was the most horrifying part, is that this creature understood when and how I noticed it, and it hid from me as easily as if it had never even been there. This monster disappeared in the darkness of the cornfield as it crouched, and that was the last I saw of it that night. From that point on, I didn't go for night walks any longer. Knowing that that thing is out there, or that there are creatures this size and this quiet that may be lurking around the cornfields and woods at night, really changes the way that you think. I'm pretty fast, and I'm pretty strong for a young male, but I can't imagine being able to outrun or overpower something that size. I'll be staying in at night from now on. Arkansas Bigfoot by Larry W. This event took place in Arkansas around 2015. I remember it like it was yesterday, which is often not the case with these sort of encounters. I was hunting in the backwoods of Dover, Arkansas, a small village in Pope County near central Arkansas. It wasn't like any other day, however. Something just seemed off. But a buddy and I shook it off and pushed on. We walked through the woods until we came to an opening. I went left, and my buddy Bo went to the right. I was at the edge of the wood line, and I had just watched Bo walk into the woods a bit further away. As I sat there, contemplating on which direction to go, not moving, a slight movement caught my eye on the other side of the woods. I saw what I thought was someone walking out of the woodline into an opening. As I stood there, staring, I noticed that the closer that this thing got, the less human it looked. I was standing there as still as a stone when this thing seemed to straighten its back and stand up straight on two legs. Even at this distance, I could tell that this animal towered over some of the taller men that I knew. It looked as if it stood at least 7 foot tall. It was covered in matted, reddish brown hair, and even though I had no idea what I was looking at, the first thing that came into my mind was Bigfoot. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I knew that this had to be real because of the vicinity in which we were hunting. We were on private family land, about a mile off any beaten path. No one other than my 72-year-old grandfather knew that we were on this land, and he isn't the kind to joke around about things like this. I stood there, paralyzed with fear. I finally took one step backward while staring at this thing, and when I did, this thing's neck snapped right in my direction, and it was staring at what felt like my soul. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It stared right at me for about 7 seconds, almost as if it was sizing me up. Then this thing took off into the tree line. Typically, this would give you some sort of relief, but in Arkansas, the trees and woods are dense, and at this point, I couldn't tell where it went, but I heard what sounded like a freight train crashing through the brush, coming my direction. When I saw this thing, it was at about 80 yards away, over a clearing. It took off into the trees and was crashing around the clearing toward where I was. I was frozen. I couldn't move as I heard this thing crashing towards me in the brush. It was a moment where I was in shock, awe, and terrified all at once. Then, it dawned on me that I still had my gun. I raised my weapon and fired a shot just above the tree line in its direction. The noise stopped. It stopped, but only for a moment, and then it veered off deeper into the woods. I thought that I had scared it away, but in the middle of all the terrifying excitement, I forgot about Bo, my hunting buddy. He went in that direction. I wanted to yell for him, but I thought it would call whatever that thing was back to where I was. All at once, I heard a gunshot, and I saw Bo running out of the woodline, screaming for me to run. So I ran faster than I had ever run in my entire life, and we both got back to the truck safely. At this point, Bo, who's a grown man, 38, was crying, ranting like a crazy person, begging me to drive. When he told me what he saw, I couldn't believe it. He saw the same creature that I had. As hard as it is to tell this story, I feel like it's necessary. These things are out there. I have no idea how many or where they are, but they're out there. It was that day that I decided not to brush off someone's personal truths because they aren't my personal beliefs. The Neighbor's Backyard Bigfoot by Jay. This took place in eastern Massachusetts, in a very fairly settled area, where one would never expect to see or experience anything like this. In 1980, in my old neighborhood, myself and a friend of mine snuck out of our houses after our parents went to bed. We kept a key hidden in the bushes to the front door, and my dog wouldn't bark when he knew it was me coming. There was no alarm system in our house, at least back then. To get out, I simply opened my second-story window, hung my legs out while dangling from the old stormed windowsill, and when I was hanging straight, I let go and dropped to the ground relatively softly on the bark mulch that surrounded the foundation. I then made my way across the street to wait for my friend Al. It was like the first or second weekend since school had started. The moon was out and it was warm with a strong wind. Clouds were lit up by the moon, which was close to full, if not completely full at the time. This will be important later. I can't remember if we had booze or weed, but we definitely did not have both. If we had both, we would have headed down the street towards the more forested area of the neighborhood, but we didn't. So when Al showed up out of the dark from his house, we decided to do the following. Our neighborhood streets made a giant square, where we would walk to the end of each street and bang a right. What's amazing is one of the streets was a main drag, and was the busier of the 4 streets that we walked. So the wind is blowing strong. The moon is bright despite the passing clouds, which would throw us into almost pitch black darkness between the occasional street lights that we hadn't shot out with our BB guns previously. It was a beautiful windy night. One of those nights that you no longer appreciate when you're older, but when you're young and the night is alive, it made us so happy to be out on the street with no masters except ourselves. We did our thing, walking in the dark and sticking to the middle of the road until a car was seen. We would then jump to the side of the road and crouch behind the nearest bush, pole, or tree and wait for the vehicle to pass. Once the coast was clear, we would resume the walk, sticking to the dark, smoking cigarettes, talking and laughing, and enjoying whatever it was we were buzzed off of. We had made only 2 or 3 laps, and I'm guessing it was well after 1 a.m. when we banged a right onto my street, and we began walking directly into the wind and began heading towards the busiest of the streets, it being a main road. Now keep in mind that there's no internet. Back then, Bigfoot, as far as my young dumb teenage self knew, was a single creature that lived in the Pacific Northwest. It was like the Loch Ness Monster. There was no thought of more than one, or breeding populations, or any of that. At the time, you only knew what you knew from a single In Search Of episode and the occasional Bigfoot book from the school library. There was no mass media available. There were 5 channels on TV that didn't even come in when it rained. That's just how it was, and trust me, it was way better that way. Less was more, less is more, but I digress. We began walking into the wind, and the clouds were flying past the moon, almost creating a slow strobe effect with there being so little light from the street lamps. There hadn't been any cars as we approached the intersection and prepared to yet again bang a right. However, as we came closer to the main road, we heard something intermittently between the roar of the wind, which had picked up and was now blowing sand in our eyes. The something we heard grew in volume, and I asked Al what he thought it was. He didn't know, and with a shrug we kept going because it hadn't scared us yet. As we got closer, this noise grew louder, and as it grew, it mingled with the increasing wind, causing us confusion and made me wonder which was which. Then another sound, high-pitched, screaming, growling, barking. We came to the street corner, and that something sound became distinguishable now as the wind died down for a second. But I was wrong. It wasn't sound. It was multiple sounds, a cacophony that scared the heck out of us, because we had basically walked into what sounded like what I guessed was a large grown man imitating the Tasmanian devil from Bugs Bunny, another large grown man imitating a police siren, and a woman or child screaming. The hair all over my body and scalp stood up. The sound was apparently coming from behind the house directly across the street. We knew the owners, who were away at the time. They had a pool in the backyard, and their backyard was fenced in. This fence protruded from both sides of the house and enclosed the pool in the back. Behind the fence was an embankment which rose up over the fence, which allowed us to see the woods behind the fencing. The screaming Tasmanian tiger growling noise only grew louder. Siren and screaming woman sounds grew as well, freaking us out. Something was going on up on the embankment. Dust and dirt were being kicked up all over and was being silhouetted against the moonlight. Something big was attacking something big, or 2 big things were attacking something else. At first I thought maybe these were dogs fighting in the dark perhaps. However, that changed quickly. This was all taking place in a matter of just a few seconds. As this was happening, we saw a huge, and I mean huge, what looked to be a few 100 pounds of a gray blur come, as it appeared, rolling down the embankment and slamming like a truck into the back of these people's fence. The force of this caused the fence to shake and reverberate all the way to the front of the house where we were standing. I can't remember if it was the sound of the breaking wood or the image of the shaking fence that made us run, but we ran back down my street. Without a word, I banged a right to my house and Al went left across a couple lawns to his. No cell phones, and 2 days later, we were asking each other what in the world that was that we saw while we were on the school bus. Unfortunately, being freshmen and all the insanity of public schools in the 1980s, it was forgotten quickly. Fast forward 30 years. I see a couple Finding Bigfoot episodes and start jumping around to various websites and YouTube channels. This is where it gets interesting, because I've still not made a connection in my mind to the distant and vague night and anything to do with Sasquatch. Then, I hear an alleged audio of a Bigfoot in Ohio, and it's making what I would describe as a siren type sound. I keep digging, and sometime later I come across recordings of what sounds like to me the Tasmanian devil on steroids, and other sounds that remind me exactly of what I heard in that thickly settled neighborhood in eastern Massachusetts many years ago. A place where there should be no Bigfoot, yet I saw and heard large things going not bump but boom in the night. For whatever reason, I never connected this incident to anything Bigfoot related until I heard what other people claimed were Bigfoot sound recordings. It all made sense now. It was, however, interestingly enough, near where the Dover demon was alleged to have been spotted a few years earlier. I don't care if people believe me. I haven't seen that kid Al in almost as many decades, but I am now convinced for many years now that these things are real. I believe they're nocturnal and creep around mostly where people aren't and are masters of camouflage, misdirection, and hiding in plain sight. I think they'll abduct anyone they can, if they can, and it explains a lot of missing people in forested areas. But what do I know? Everyone seems to be an expert these days. All I can say is whatever we saw and heard that night was no human or known animal. Mammoth Lakes Bigfoot by Hand of Doom 97. August 4th, 2017. We had decided to do some hiking in and around Mammoth Lakes, California. My ex-fiance and I were avid climbers, hikers, and explorers of the Eastside Sierra Nevada mountain range, and we decided to go up to Yosemite to climb. Now, Yosemite is stupid crazy to get campsite reservations for, so we decided to stay on the Bureau of Land Management land a few miles down the 395 from Mammoth Lakes, where we didn't have to pay for camping. We pitched our tent and got settled in, made dinner, then I went to go set up our trash bag about 1,000 feet away from camp because I don't want to have bears close to my tent. It started to rain a little, so we went into the tent to hang out for a little while before going to sleep around what I would guess was 10:30 p.m. It was probably around 1:30 a.m. that morning, the morning of the 5th, that it had stopped raining and I had to take a leak. So I put my flip-flops on and my headlamp on as well and started walking to the spot where I figured was far away enough that it wouldn't attract anything. Now, it had just stopped raining, so when it was dead quiet, I dismissed the silence as everything was hunkered down. From where I was taking a leak, the trash bag was about 200 yards to my right. As I finished up, I looked to make sure the trash bag wasn't blown down during the relatively heavy storm that had just finished up. To my surprise, it wasn't in the tree, so I looked at the ground and saw the biggest black bear I'd ever seen in my life over top of this bag that had been torn open. So I start walking towards this thing, and I begin hollering and screaming, making a lot of noise to scare it off. Then, it fucking stood up and looked at me. Completely covered in hair, this thing stood about 8 feet tall with shoulders as wide as a meter stick, so around 3 feet or more. It stared at me and then ran off on 2 legs. In my head I said, "Fuck this, I'm going back to the tent," and I sprinted the entire way back. I get back in the tent and my fiance asked why I was yelling, so I told her I was scaring off a bear from the trash bag. She snuggles back in and falls asleep. At this point, I'm wide awake, listening intently for any movement when I start hearing footsteps around the car, which is where we kept the food. And then the footsteps started coming toward the tent, and to be honest, I was afraid thinking that this thing, whatever it was, could just come through the tent if it wanted to. It started touching the tent, and I can hear heavy breathing and grunting just a few feet from where our legs are. Next, my fiance wakes up. She suddenly begins to freak out, thinking it was the bear that I told her about. In a daze, and thinking as quickly as she could, she grabs her keys and hits the panic button on the vehicle. The car begins alarming, and we can hear clearly as whatever the creature was, right next to us, takes off into the woods, sounding to me as if it was bipedal or on 2 feet. I didn't encounter anything else on that trip, and I played it off to her as if it was a bear. Looking back, we should have probably found somewhere new to camp the next night. On August 6th, we packed up and left early to go climb in Yosemite, and when we came back that night, we had found a new campsite to pitch our tent. While at our new campsite, I approached another camper that I recognized from the previous night, and he had asked me if I had noticed anything weird going on the night before. I told him the story of what I had encountered early the previous morning, and he said that he had heard my screaming and our car alarm, and both times shortly after our noises, he heard something walking in a full loop around and through his campsite. While going into his vehicle the next morning, he noticed that there were huge handprints on his car windows, and he was freaked out enough to move to a new spot as well, which is where we found him. He pitched a tent 30 feet from where we were, and we remained together for the remainder of our trip. I'm not sure what I saw, to be honest with you, but I can guarantee you that this animal, creature, or whatever you want to refer to it as, was no bear. The only thing that comes to mind when I remember that night was that this was either a Bigfoot or the largest and hairiest man I have ever seen in my life. It Had the Eyes of a Human by C.E. Yingich. I was the new kid at school, as I just moved to Longview, Washington near the end of 5th grade, just in time for the end of the school year week-long campout. Now, I was excited to meet new friends and enjoy the forest that I've always loved so much. I was from Alaska and had a big love of the wilderness, the outdoors, and wild animals. We arrived at camp on Monday, mid-morning. I had camped many times in my short life, but only in a tent thus far, so I was excited to stay in a cabin. There was a main lodge with cabins on 2 sides, 6 to 8 cabins in total, and they all each had about 8 cots inside with 1 separate bathroom building. On the far side of the lodge, there was an open field, large enough to play softball in, lined by forest and woods on 3 sides, with a small creek about 20 feet wide just inside the tree line. I learned at breakfast the first morning that one of the girls in the next cabin had heard knocking and scratching on the outside walls and had seen big yellow eyes looking at her through the window in her cabin, even though the windows were up really high above the chaperones' heads. The general idea, and from what we were told, is that some of the older boys were pranking them, and we thought no more about it. As for me, I slept like a log through the previous night, and I never heard a thing, so I brushed it all off as some joke. That same night, as we ate dinner in the lodge, seated in the long picnic-type tables, I was sitting against the wall under a window and across from my new friend, Jackie. We were talking and giggling when all of a sudden, Jackie looked up in horror at the window several feet above my head. At the same time, she flipped backward off her bench seat, screaming, "Monster! Monster!" The adults in the room came running over to her, began shaking her, and one of them slapped her in the face and told her she was causing a panic with the other kids. As punishment, they sat her outside at the far end of the lodge building, where 2 large doors opened up like barn doors. They sat her out there in the dark, alone, staring at the dark forest in front of her. I stayed as close to her as they would let me, and I talked to her the entire time to let her know that she wasn't alone. Jackie was physically sick the rest of the night, as well as into the next day. Day 3 started out okay, except Jackie was sick and stayed in the cabin, so I took a group hike to the river and returned to camp for lunch. After lunch, we all, the entire camp except Jackie, met out in the field to play an exciting game of softball. We must have played for about 2 hours before the game came to an end. All of the kids, the teachers, and a few of the parents headed toward the lodge and cabin area across the field, while 2 other girls and myself stood at the edge of the woods talking and giggling. My back was to the woods, and the 2 girls were facing me as we spoke to one another. While we were talking, their demeanors changed. It happened all of a sudden, and their faces turned to horror, the same way Jackie's had the night before. Then, they turned and ran. I know that I started to run too, but at the same time, I looked over my left shoulder, and then had to glance up at what I was looking at. I locked eyes with this huge creature, and somehow, I just started to circle it. Never breaking eye contact except when I was behind him, at which point he was twisting at the waist to make eye contact with me, never moving his feet to turn around and face me. He had this surprised look on his face. I don't know how many times I ran around him, or if I was running at all. Maybe I was just walking, but I do know that I was only inches from him as I circled, in shock, I guess. I know I circled him at least 3 times, maybe more, and all of a sudden I heard my name being called by more than a few voices. They called out for me. "Aaron, run this way. Aaron, run this way." Somehow I managed to get myself running toward the campers standing on the far edge of the field. Everyone was there, I'd say 30 to 40 people, mostly 5th and 6th graders, but at least 10 adults running to me to make sure I was okay. This creature was 6.5 to 7 foot tall, with a rounded head that was covered in a reddish-brown hair. It had less hair on its face, and I could see that his skin was a medium tan color, kind of like buckskin. His eyes were an amber-brown color with whites showing as well. In fact, they looked just like human eyes, except for the size, which was way larger than a human's, and he had a surprised expression on his face, as if I shouldn't have been there, or as if I shouldn't have seen him. Within 2 hours, we were being bussed out of the camp because of what the adults said was a bear in the camp. That was no bear. All our buses pulled out, and I watched hunters getting out of their trucks carrying rifles. They had been called in by the school right after the incident. Our parents were told to pick us up at the school 2 days early because of the bear incident. Nobody told my mother what happened to me either. My brothers, one older and one younger, believed me. In fact, about a week after this event had happened, my older brother came home with a book or a magazine with a picture of Bigfoot and asked me if this is what I had saw. Yes, I told him. Now my monster had a name, and it was Bigfoot. This has given me a lifelong interest in Bigfoot, although I only discussed it with my family and a few very close friends until just recently. I decided to reach out and see if any of those people from that day would like to talk about their sighting to hopefully understand a bit better what we all experienced. As an 11 or so year old girl, alone in the woods with possibly the most dangerous creature I've ever seen, I can truly say that this legend is more than just stories by campfires. Because in Longview, Washington, something creeps around when the sun goes down. Our final story is brought to you by David over at Pack West Bigfoot and an anonymous user. Trout Lake, Washington Bigfoot. I was doing some camping and fishing up around Trout Lake in Washington State when I got my own scare from a couple Bigfoot, and they were doing some pretty strange stuff too. Fishing, hiking, camping. It is what I love to do, even 15 years later after getting a pretty scary visual on a couple Bigfoot, something I never thought existed before that day. But they do, and here's what I observed that day and why I peeled out of there fast. June, July, they are great. Even August and September are good for some trout fishing at Trout Lake in the state of Washington. Personally, I do not live in Washington. I live in Oregon, actually, but Trout Lake is a place I like to go almost every June or July for some fishing, just because I know I'll catch some nice-sized trout every time. Plus, it is a beautiful place to just crash in the back of my SUV or truck and enjoy nature for a couple of days. But nature can be a huge, massive, crazy, scary, and downright weird, especially when Bigfoot is involved. Yes, I said Bigfoot. For those of you who do not believe and think that these are all stories ginned up by the yokels living in the boondocks. Bigfoot, it was something I thought was literally made up myself. I know. I sound like a hypocrite by the statement above, and I'm no yokel from the middle of nowhere. But today, I think the Patterson-Gimlin film is not the only proof out there. I think the stories and reports from folks like myself are true more often than not. But here's what happened to me. Well, what I observed at least on the far shore of Trout Lake in 2004. So in 2000 I moved to Oregon from Astoria because the move was due to the fact that I wanted to start a small hobby farm of a particular product, and even today it is still going well. But that was not the only reason I moved there. D seemed pretty central to some great places to get in some hiking, fishing, and outdoor photography. Matter of fact, I am a photographer for a certain magazine, even today. Thus the reason for sharing only my first name here. I've been a professional photographer since the late 90s and love especially night photography. It was nighttime when it would see something completely crazy, well, just about dark at least. Like I said, it was July, the tail end of June 2004, when I decided to get some fishing in and do some night photography around the Trout Lake area. I'd been there 3 times over the previous 2 years and loved the area. This trip, I'd take night sky pictures, you know, the swirly stars and clear shots of the Milky Way using really slow shutter speeds. I would also be fishing, of course, my second favorite hobby that I don't get paid for, but enjoy, I'd say, a bit more than the other, to be honest. But I do not want to spend too much time on that stuff. I had a pretty insane encounter with these Bigfoot creatures, primates, whatever you want to call them. And personally, I think they are more like primates than anything, and even a bit more intelligent, I think. Trout Lake is a more glorified pond than a lake, I would say, but it contains trout and has a pretty great landscape for more ambient light at night, as it sits in a pretty low valley just outside of the GPN forest in Washington. It is a pretty popular little lake for hikers and fishermen like me, and even the local campers who truly enjoy roughing it without a shower for the weekend. But for me, it is all about the fishing and photography. That weekend called for clear nights, but some overcast days, and that was good enough for me to decide to make the trip and enjoy a whole weekend of my favorite sport, and get some pictures into the magazine for an outdoors wrap-up. I headed out and was there in time to get some fishing in. Setting up camp came first, of course. Next was making sure that and double-checking on the camera gear, and then yes, finally fishing. Apparently the rain that lasted almost a week on and off previously kept folks at bay from heading up there as I was, or seemed to be, completely alone up there. I was happy about that actually, at first at least. I do not take a camera with me fishing, by the way, not while I'm actually out there. I use those inflated float tubes. They are great for fishing, but they have little room for cameras, and changing lenses is out of the question. However, I wish I'd had it. Sure would have made the best headline and front page shot ever. I decided to fish for a while and then get set up for some night photography before it got dark. I'd then eat some supper, read for a bit, and then get some fishing in for a couple hours. At least that was the plan. It was funny though, I realized later when I looked back, the woods were really quiet that afternoon. I mean, there was not a lot of drowning bug sounds, some birds chirps here and there, but not as many as I should have believed. The forest, well, it was pretty silent, even eerily so. I had done everything I wanted to do and then headed back to the lake to fish for the evening in my glorified floating device. I was fishing near a little outcropping of bushes when things would turn into the craziest event and day of my life. Remember, this is more of a glorified pond than a lake, if you ask me, so seeing pretty clearly across the other side is easy, even if you have poor vision, I'm sure. But I heard what sounded like someone calling to someone else, only I could not make out the words. After a few of these shout-outs, it became apparent that it was either in a foreign language or was just gibberish. It was deep in sound, like some really big man trying to yell out over a crowd to a friend. And then, the friend answered to my amazement. To me, it sounded pretty clear that two very large bikers from Sweden or Russia were about to pop out of the tree line on either side of the far shoreline. Well, they were not people, that's for dang sure. At first, and for the most split of seconds, yeah, I thought it was a person in some ghillie suit. But no, I soon realized that this was the legend that up to that point never even entered my mind as being even remotely possible. Bigfoot. The first of the two I would watch that day for nearly 2 minutes or so, maybe 3. I can't remember that specifically, but this one was the biggest. It was solid black in color, and the hair seemed to be at least a couple 2 to 3 inches long, and maybe longer along the arms as I could see it blowing in the light breeze as it walked out of the trees. Its arms were extremely long, down past its knees, and yes, like many solid reports, it walked really weird, and 1 foot in front of the other with a stride that must have been 4 to 5 feet in length. I also want to mention that it did have a slightly cone-shaped head on it. This thing had to be all of 9 feet tall too, and its face was covered in hair, all of it, which later I would learn was not usual in many reports. But this one, well, all you could see of the face was a heavy brow line and large dark holes where the eyes were, but I could not see them clearly. Then, to my even bigger surprise, a more cinnamon and color Bigfoot came out from the opposite side. This one was almost the same as the other in build and most features. However, there was some skin tone, ashen in color around its nose and to the top of its forehead that could be seen. It was almost as tall as well and had a similar cone-shaped head to it. I was then catching myself reeling in my line really quietly. I was pretty much in a panic mode, but trying to stay calm and collected. As I said, I reeled in quietly, but otherwise stood completely still, just floating there. Yes, I wish I would have had my camera, but hey, I was fishing. They kept looking at each other as if they were sizing each other up, I suppose, but I am no expert, nor will I ever be about Bigfoot, so I'll leave the hypothesis up to you for now. But they looked as though they were not familiar with each other one bit. Both stood their ground once they had seen the other. There was no movement whatsoever. I mean, they were literally like statues. This is why I do believe we pass by them more frequently than we think. They can stand still, very, very still. After what seemed 30 or so seconds, the cinnamon-colored one moved forward, tilting its head in a weird cockeyed fashion. It was as if it were trying to get a better look at the other one, or something. But it took 3 giant strides and was now about 20 feet or so in front of the other. The black one then took a step forward and went to all fours, but never taking its eyes off the other, or so it seemed. And again, neither moved after that for what seemed another 30 or so seconds. All of a sudden, the chatter came, in waves from both sides. It was scary to hear, and even scarier to watch as they practically yelled at each other. Now, I'm not sure they were yelling at each other the way people do when they're upset. I am just saying it was very loud. After a few seconds of that, back and forth, the cinnamon-colored Bigfoot walked forward to the other, came within a few feet of it, and the other one stood straight up and was at least a few inches taller. They mumbled back and forth and started looking around the area. At that moment, I swear the black one spotted me. He looked in my direction and seemed to, well, squint in a way. It at least leaned forward a bit and looked in my direction. Next thing you know, it screamed, something I never want to hear again in my life. It took a few steps into the water, and it began splashing about and slapping it with its large hands and yelling in my direction. I was freaking out, and then noticed that the other one was gone. It vanished. I started moving fast at that point. I was not sure if it ran off or was coming around to get me. I wanted to get out of the water and into my vehicle fast. Where in the world did it go? They were both gone now. By the time I reached the shoreline, I was quickly back by my rig and defloating the floaty as quickly as possible, all the while scanning the vicinity for any movement. I saw nothing, but I did hear movement from the right of me. It was just inside the tree line in thick brush. They were moving, both of them. I could tell because I heard the movement of 2 pairs of legs walking around. After a couple of minutes, I was almost packed up when the screaming started up again, and I was what they call bluff charged. I wanted to get a picture. I had to, I felt. But I had to throw everything in the SUV as the screaming started up again. I got most everything in, but the camera that was set up for the pictures that night, although I would not be there. I put the tripod in the back and tried to snap off some pictures before I got in myself and take off. But I dropped the camera when all of a sudden that tall, dark, scary monster came running out of the trees and bushes right at me. I dropped my camera and dove into the SUV. I could literally hear the footsteps hit the ground with each giant step it took, and it screamed so loud I practically fell over before I could barely even open the door. I thought for a fleeting second that I was going to be hurt, or worse. Blackness, a mass of black, ran at me, and I ran away, and rightfully so. I did not even look back. I started the car, peeled out in the dirt, and left so fast I almost hit 2 trees on the way out. I drove home and was there by evening, just after nightfall actually. I sat with Rebecca, my fiance at the time, my wife today, and told her what happened. She believed me. However, she was a little miffed that I lost a nearly $1,600 camera, and so was I. We were saving for a wedding at that time. Personally, we both got past that real quick when I told her what happened and how the larger one charged at me and I barely got away. I still go out in the woods though, and I go to Trout Lake, even at night. It took me a while though to get the nerve up to go to that particular place, but well, I love it there. However, never go alone. Today, I take Rebecca or a friend and a gun along when we do fishing and night photography there. But this is my story. Thanks for listening. All too often are the things that go bump in the night more than just the wind outside of your bedroom window. True stories of Bigfoot and Sasquatch encounters continue to rise to the surface, each time seeming to become more and more personal. Don't let yourself be the one that doesn't make it back with a story of your own. Like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you all for the amazing support, and any constructive criticism is appreciated. Just leave your feedback in the comments. If I sound slightly different from one story to the next, it's because I'm still trying to find my niche or narrator's voice. Additionally, I'm beginning to realize it's best to record stories all at once, instead of different times, which is why my voice sounds so different at times, due to waking up with a raspy tone and such. Tell me, do you prefer a scarier tone narration, or a normal conversation type of narration? Leave your answer in the comments and hopefully we'll all be around for the next story. Good night, and I'll see you at the next video.